Rachel, wonderful to see you again. Happy New Year. I hope it blesses you personally and in your career, which, as I have oft predicted, will definitely end on Capitol Hill in one form or another, if I'm any judge. But speaking of Capitol Hill, I noticed that Nancy Pelosi has just bought another $20 million worth of stock. Should we be following her?
First and foremost, I do want to say Happy New Year to you too, George, and to everyone here at Most. It's interesting because we talk so much about Nancy Pelosi and about the moves she has made and about what is essentially insider trading, especially on Capitol Hill. And it's funny because the members of Congress, of course, if they're asked about it, the majority of them, there are a few, such as Elizabeth Warren and AOC, who will say that they think that insider trading should be banned on Capitol Hill. But the majority of them, people like Nancy Pelosi, will say that they're all for it. And it's hilarious to me because she was actually asked about this just a few weeks ago. And her response was that it should be allowed because the United States has a free market. But when you look at the U.S. economy, when you look at the members of Congress and the decisions that they make, with the knowledge that they have, especially when it comes to those stock purchases, it doesn't really seem that free, does it? When you have insider knowledge, when you have special briefings and you are specifically making trades as a result of that, all of a sudden that freedom really isn't there in the way that they say it is. It's much more them gaming the system. So I would say, if you think that you're going to take best right along with her, she's not looking at losing any money anytime soon.
No, that's sure. I mean, the feminists claim that, well, it's her husband that's buying the stock. But here in this country, we have a kind of, certainly when it comes to tax matters and so on, we take the view that a husband and wife are profiting corporately from such things. So unless she never tells during her pillow talk with her exceedingly rich husband anything that she learned during the day, and he's just the oracle who happens to pick the shares that are going up, up, up and up, we have to assume that she is at least giving him a decent steer. Now, staying in D.C. For a minute, how is the administration coping with the plummeting opinion poll ratings? All these former allies in the liberal media and so on, now they can't seem to stand Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. What's that all about?
Yeah, they're not coping too well. And it's interesting to kind of see the season that we're in, because right now you're really seeing this push, especially by Democrats, by the Biden administration, because we are coming up on the 1-year anniversary of the riots at the U.S. Capitol that occurred on January 6th of last year. And so you're kind of seeing this push to try to bring this back around, to try to talk more about it, because they know that Donald Trump isn't done yet. They know that he is coming back. And so as a result of that, it's kind of a great way for them to shift away from what has been the falling poll numbers and what is looking like it's going to be not the best midterm elections that the Democrats have ever had. Because I know we talk a lot about how the Democrats have the majority in the House, the Senate, and the Oval Office. But the reality is that they only have the majority slightly. So if we go into the 2022 midterm elections and the Republicans gain just 5 additional seats in the House of Representatives, they have the majority. If they gain just a couple of seats in the Senate, they can get the majority. And so we really are looking at razor-thin margins right here. And what you're seeing as a result of that is that Democrats are trying to deflect and say, hey, remember what happened on January 6th? Remember how terrible and horrible we told you that these Capitol riots are. Remember how we didn't focus on the fact that there was a need for enforced police presence, and we instead focused on trying to make a bunch of, crazy protesters look as though they were going to really overthrow the U.S. government. they're going to be saying, let's focus on that and make sure that it doesn't happen again, except, of course, their way of making it not happen again is never the actual way that would make sense.
Well, unpleasant as those events may have been, particularly for workers that were caught in amongst them through no fault of their own, it pales into insignificance compared to actual coup d'etat that the United States government has been responsible for over decades. I mean, they didn't set the parliament on fire like they did in the Ukraine, for example. They didn't murder the president in the presidential palace like they did to Salvador Allende in Chile. They didn't drown the country in blood like the United States did in Indonesia and many, many other places. Is that still able to fly, the January 6th narrative?
Well, that's an excellent point, and I think that the CIA was probably ashamed to watch their own Americans go into the U.S. Capitol and basically just sit there and take selfies. And, I mean, whatever else they were doing, it was laughable that the Democrats continued to try to claim that this group of people who, in some cases, we had guards letting them into the U.S. Capitol building, they were seen there walking around. They seem to have no plan whatsoever. And yet, at the same time, you still get this continued media narrative, which is that there is this underlying domestic terrorist, as it were, here in the country that wants to take over the U.S. government, that wants to put someone like Donald Trump back in power. And it's incredibly concerning for those of us who are already questioning the U.S. government, questioning its motives on a number of things. And then you see this continued push to say, hey, we need to take on the domestic terrorists. Well, it didn't go so well when the United States decided that it was going to take on the international terrorists, so to speak, in its so-called war on terror. So there is a lot of concern here about this narrative. But at the same time, I think it is one of those things where it mainly lies in certain segments of the population and certain political parties, and that luckily does not speak for the entirety of the country.
Moving to New York, the trial ended. A verdict was eventually reached, and to the surprise of many, it was a unanimous verdict of guilty on the sex trafficker Maxwell, erstwhile of this parish, but for the next indeterminate so far number of years, going to be kept at the U.S. taxpayers' expense behind bars. Did the verdict come as a surprise in the circles that you work in?
You know, it wasn't fully a surprise. It was interesting because I know the last time we talked, I was a little bit cynical about this, and I will say I still am, even though we got that guilty verdict, mainly just because this was a trial where we didn't get to hear from Ghislaine herself. We only got to hear from 4 victims when we know that there are far, far many more who would be able to speak to this. And so I think that there's a lot about the entire Jeffrey Epstein saga that still remains kind of covered up. And whenever it came to the Ghislaine Maxwell trial, that was one of those things where you saw really a frustration building online with the lack of media coverage surrounding it, the lack of people who were talking about it. And so the hope is going to be that maybe now she will decide to name some names. I mean, she is looking at spending the rest of her life in prison. So the question then becomes, is she actually going to speak up, and is she going to realize that, you know, she's looking at 2 different ends here, and one of those ends could be with her actually talking and telling the world the truth about what she went through now that she's looking at a continued guilty verdict, whereas before we continued to see this media push to try to, you know, posture her as Jeffrey Epstein's poor girlfriend to try to feel sorry for her. Well, people aren't feeling sorry for her anymore, especially with this verdict in place.
Well, another option is to tell part of the truth, or what one will claim to be part of the truth. Let me run past you what I ran past Kirby Summers. It's very obvious that Bill Clinton, especially, but also Hillary Clinton, had what now can only be described as an obscene closeness to Jeffrey Epstein, the child rapist, but to a slightly lesser extent, but still discernible, so did Donald Trump. What if Maxwell now tries to put Trump in the frame? And the quid pro quo being, after a decent period, a pardon from Joe Biden or Kamala Harris.
That's actually a really interesting idea there. That's one I haven't thought of. And, you know, that could be plausible. At this point, I think just about anything could be plausible. Now, as far as Joe Biden actually pardoning someone like Ghislaine Maxwell, I mean, I guess that would be just fitting at the end of all of this. But then at the same time, it would be one of those things that we could see come up more and more, especially as the election approaches. And, you know, it's interesting because what we've heard from the victims has specifically been, they've said, yes, Donald Trump was a close friend of Jeffrey Epstein, but we haven't heard nearly the same claims as we have from the victims who have talked about people like Bill Clinton being much more involved with the abuse, people like Prince Andrew, that sort of thing. And so I could definitely see a case where the narrative is kind of spun around to say, hey, let's not talk about all of these other people who are involved in this circle. Let's just look at a few select people that fits our narrative. And you know that the media will actually run with that, and they will actually talk about that because, of course, even now Donald Trump is still one of their favorite people, and he is still one of the people who brings in ratings like no other.
Well, remember, you heard it here first. Finally, and I'm grateful for your time, Rachel, Prince Andrew, is in court, or rather his lawyers are, on Tuesday. They're still trying to get this case thrown out. They failed on the first attempt to try and get it ruled out on the basis that the accuser lives in Australia and not in the United States, even though she has a house in the United States and has residency there. So they failed on that, but they're going to try again on Tuesday. Is anyone paying attention to the Prince Andrew story in the United States?
You know, it's not getting nearly as much attention as it should. And I think that also brings up another important point here, which was that the accusers that we did hear from during the Ghislaine Maxwell trial, there were so many of them that were missing. And so I would really hope that there would be much more of a spotlight put on this upcoming trial, especially if we actually get to hear from Prince Andrew, because he has been one of the most guarded people in all of this. And you literally have someone like Virginia Giuffre standing there saying, here are the photos, here is what I went through, here is my testimony. This should be a massive scandal that receives international coverage. And yet there's really not that much talk about the fact that you've got a trial upcoming that he may actually have to face. And so I think that it brings it back around to just how important it is that people pay attention to shows like yours where you're actually talking about it and giving it some spotlight.
Mine and yours. Thank you very much, Rachel Blevins, American icon. Thanks always for joining us.